I don't care how strong your marriage is. We have a really strong marriage, I think, but no matter who you are, it can be tested because of aging parents.
And how do you handle it? How do you treat each other?
Yes.
How do you, if you don't like the decisions that your spouse is making, there's so many issues that come up.
Yes.
We're going to bring in a licensed clinical social worker supervisor, Diana Schaefer, to talk with us today. She's with Just Mind Counseling. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I think a lot of times we think just about the care that we're providing to our parent, and we don't always think about the impact that it has on those around us, and especially our spouses who are closest around us. So many topics to talk about. Let's start with, though, what do we do when our spouse is potentially resentful of the time that we're spending caring for our parents?
Well, I think first of all, I want you to know that my mother-in-law lives with us. So I'm living with this and
Yes.
dealing with this in my own marriage. So
Yes.
it's something very poignant for me and very real. And I think first and foremost, having open communication is so important. Really talking about what the expectations are and sharing your feelings, I think, is super important. You have to feel like your spouse is supporting you
Mm-hmm.
because it's not easy. There's a lot of challenges when you're brought in a third person into, your relationship.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you do, though, if they're not very nice about it, or that they really are very much about, creating drama?
Kind of resentful.
Right, and resentful.
Hmm. Right. Well, I think a few things are really important. One is that I think both parties need to really focus on self-care,
Mm-hmm.
focus on the marriage, that you have to put the priority, just as you do when you have a child, that the marital relationship has to be the priority.
Mm.
Now, when there's a lot of resentment built up, probably professional counseling wouldn't be a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a safe place to share some of those feelings that might be difficult to share just with your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the hard thing for a lot of us is that comparing it to having a child, when you have a child, hopefully you both love the child immensely. When you have a mother-in-law or a father-in-law, you may like them, but you haven't grown up with them. You don't have that family
bond.
Their bond, I really need to take care of them. It's, well, they're just an outsider. Do I really have to put up with this? And that makes it tougher, I think, for some of us to go through that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we try to do, and I think is so important, is respite, is either to bring in other caregivers, or we're fortunate enough to have my husband's sister in Dallas. So we can travel, and my mother-in-law goes to Dallas with her daughter. So at least we have that. Not everybody has that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is important, though, to figure out how you can get that respite,
Mm-hmm.
so that resentment doesn't build up
Yeah.
and destroy your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And respite for those people who might not know, or just giving yourself some time, whether it's them being able to go to potentially an assisted living for a respite stay, or having another family member who can carry some
Step in
and help. And don't you think, I think it can be different for couples depending on if the parent is living with you 24/7, where they are in the next room all the time, versus are in their own home or in independent living or assisted living.
Right.
Although in that situation, you may, if they're not in the same town, you may be spending a lot of time away from home as the spouse who's caring for your parent. So I think there's so many different layers to that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think in those situations that you have to, it's very important. The communication is so important, to talk about the challenges and to try to negotiate, with your spouse, and set some boundaries, I think, on both sides, right? This is how much time I need to spend with my parent, versus, this is how much time we need to spend together, and to really work that out.
You mentioned negotiate with your spouse. I'm of the belief that the main two things you have to be is not be selfish, and you have to think about what the other person is going through, because it's not you, it's not your personality. But when you don't
Right.
agree with the way they do it, if Kim is treating her mom in a certain way, which you don't, but if she's treating her mom in a certain way, or if she's doing something with her mom, then I'm like, I can't believe you're doing this. This is driving me crazy. You've got to talk about it, but how can you get through those barriers
Mhm.
just so that you can agree on things, even though you're two different people?
Mhm.
Well, as I said, sometimes it does require some professional counseling.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Um, but you're right. I think negotiation, though, is one of those very, very important things in a relationship. I mean, everybody has a right to have non-negotiables,
Yeah.
Mhm.
but in managing something like this, there's a lot of stress involved, and it's so important to first of all try to be empathic to what your spouse is going through, and flexibility.
Mhm.
And I think those are things that help in any marriage, no matter what your situation is, but certainly in a situation like this where where someone is taking care of an
Mhm.
elderly parent.
So tensions are often high anyway because there are potentially sick people
Mhm.
that you're
Hmm.
working with, and
Yeah.
so that in and of
Right.
itself creates a little bit of stress. What
Sure.
about when they just, you know, don't necessarily agree with the way you're treating the parent? And we asked in our community for questions, and somebody said, I don't necessarily love the way I see my husband treating his mom, and
Mhm.
how do I not project that I'm worried now that that might be the way he treats me?
Well, I think it's important to not look at things in the future and predict this is how it's going to be. I think again that's those kinds of feelings need to get expressed,
Hmm.
and expressed in a very non-blaming or judging way. But if that person can express it in a way of this is how it is impacting me when I see you do this,
Hmm.
hopefully can have an impact, a different impact.
Hmm.
Is there ever, Kim and I always talk about having to not only communicate, but to plan early. Is there a
Hmm.
limit to that? Back in 1988, when we had our first date, should I have said, "Hey, Kim, I'm Mike. Is your mom going to live with you someday?" That type of thing.
Right.
How do you treat that?
Right. Because I had a woman that I talked with who said that she was dating in her 40s, and that was absolutely a conversation that was brought up. And in one
Yeah.
relationship, when the guy she was dating said, just so you know, that absolutely my mom will live with us until the very end, non-negotiable. And the
Hmm.
woman said, I realized that that wasn't what I predicted for this future of mine, and so that ended the relationship. That is a big consideration.
Right. And I guess that's like one of those non-negotiables I talked
Mhm.
about, that for her, that she just wasn't going to be able to do that. And I think that's important. It's important to know what your own boundaries are,
Mhm.
Mhm.
what you can and cannot accept in that kind of a situation. Obviously, it's different if you've been married for many years and then,
Right.
the,
Hadn't thought to have
the,
those conversations ahead of time.
right, right, exactly. But they need to be had, right? It may not be, it should be ahead of time of a parent coming to live with you, certainly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And, you know, to try to support each other mutually, I think
Mhm.
is so important. And figure out how can we relieve the stress, right?
Mhm.
What can we do together? I mean, certainly date nights are super important. We need also to figure out how each person can get their own time to
Mhm.
take care of themselves,
Yeah.
exercise, and you know
And in some
do
ways,
what they need to do.
don't you need to go back to, okay, what attracted you to each other, and
Mm,
rely on that, whether it's having a fun date night, or spending time together at a park, reading a book, reading the Bible, going to church, whatever it may be.
Watching a
Yeah,
movie.
what's that
right.
common denominator that got you together in the first place? Let's make sure we
Yeah.
bring that back.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What about the situations where we are in the thick of it? Our parents are getting declining, and
Hmm.
we can see that they're all the parents are kind of declining at a similar rate. And so we're sort of already anticipating the grief that is going to become both of us potentially close together. Is there a way to start sort of preparing for that ahead of time?
Um, well, I think just having, talking about that and really thinking about, well, how are we going to deal with that, and giving each other the space that each person needs to do their grieving, because no two people grieve alike.
Right.
That can be very different. And
Hmm.
that is a really, really hard thing, right? To lose a parent. And for you both losing parents, even harder,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And how,
Because
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because the spouse obviously has a relationship with your parent as well, right? So,
Sure. How do
mm,
you start, or should you start kind of thinking about what is that new normal going to look like? Similar, I think, I guess, when you have kids going off to college and you become an empty nester, it is sort of odd where, so much focus is
mm,
on raising your children. And then all of a sudden you look at each other and think, oh, it's just us now, and I guess that could also be just, obviously a different stage, but kind of similar.
yeah, for sure. And I think that's why it's so important that while you're caring for the elderly parent, that you focus on the marriage and put that relationship first, because it just like when a kid goes, or when the kids go to college and you're an empty nester, you're left with the relationship, right?
Hmm.
And you want that to be strong.
Hmm.
I think you're definitely emphasizing the fact that you need to communicate with each other and maybe get a counselor slash therapist involved. But also,
Hmm.
you need to talk to the parents. Do you need to talk to, whether it's the aging parent living with you or the aging parent who's 200 miles or 2,000 miles away? Do you need to talk to them and say, look, we need our time alone. We need our time together. Please let us escape every once in a while, and
Hmm.
make sure that that's on the table.
Absolutely, I think that's really important, and it's not something that's easy to do. Um, I know for us, we like to travel, and so like I said, we fortunately have my sister-in-law who can take my mother-in-law when we travel.
Hmm.
But it would be very hard for me to say to her, "Hey, we just need that time apart from you." But I mean, that has something to do with, you know, her sensitivity and my sensitivity to her feelings, etc.
Hmm.
But if you can, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the hardest part is that
Yeah.
we hear so many stories when there's dementia involved where you can't
Yeah.
necessarily reason with them and
Hmm.
they can become demanding and not necessarily
Hmm.
realize they're doing that. And so I guess it's trying to create boundaries, even though they're not able necessarily to allow for that,
Yeah.
which I mean,
Right.
obviously throws a whole nother kind of dimension to the dynamic.
Absolutely. And that's what we're struggling with also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough process, but Diana,
Yeah.
thank you for people like you who are able to help marriages stay
Mhm.
strong and stay together.
I do have one question,
Well,
which
thank
is
you.
if you have
Sure.
a spouse who
Hmm.
it is really becoming a struggle, and like you mentioned, maybe it is time to bring in some professional help. How do you get that spouse to be on board if that's not something that they're necessarily thinking is needed? They just think, oh, you just need to quit spending so much time with them, or you need to quit dropping everything and going to them. And maybe, they're thinking it's your behavior, and
Hmm.
maybe there's a part of that, but how do you get the other spouse to be open to having those discussions with help?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself,
Yeah.
again, it's about communicating, communicating your feelings, that this is something that you feel you really need a professional
Yeah.
to help your spouse understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
That they may not see it as a problem, but if you see it as a problem, it's a problem.
Hmm. So
Makes
I mean,
yeah.
I think that can happen with marital therapy in general. Sometimes one person is interested in it and the other one feels like there isn't a problem. But
yeah.
Right.
if someone's unhappy, there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so got to
Yeah.
ask for help sometimes.
Yeah. Hopefully we can get things
Yeah.
fixed. Diana, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all your tips and advice.
Well, thank you for having me.
I think what we've definitely learned if we didn't already know, is you have to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
You have to talk. You have to get on the same page and try to work things out.
Not always easy.
No.
And very, very important because, as she said, that relationship, you want that relationship to last through the process and afterward. Yeah.
Hey, if you have any other topics you'd like us to discuss, please let us know. Parenting aging parents.